Baik, ini anak-anak sekalian, kita hari ini akan akan kuliah mengenai porifera ya. Porifera. Nah, porifera itu adalah binatang, termasuk kelompok binatang yang dia multiseluler. Artinya dia memiliki lebih dari satu sel. Namun di sini termasuk kelompok binatang multiseluler yang primitif, artinya dia belum memiliki atau fungsi-fungsi atau alat organ khusus yang memiliki fungsi untuk reproduksi misalnya, untuk respirasi, kemudian untuk sekresi dan sebagainya. Nah, kalau dalam sehari-hari kita mengenalnya sebagai spons. Jadi spons, kemudian sebagaimana kita ketahui spons itu hidupnya di air ya, di dalam perairan, kemudian ada air laut dan air tawar. Nah, untuk selanjutnya barangkali kita lihat dulu video yang akan ditayangkan, kemudian nanti akan kita bahas sama-sama.
He knows a lot about the science stuff, Professor Dave explains.
A bit earlier in the series, we talked about the origin of multicellular life. We discussed choanoflagellates and sponges, noting that these represent the emergence of animal life around 600 million years ago. Since organisms resembling modern sponges are likely the ancestors of all the animals on Earth, it is with such organisms that we will begin our exploration of the animal kingdom. Sponges are members of Filum Porifera. The name porifera means pore bearer, which is very fitting for sponges since they're full of pores, or ostia. Tiny little holes cover their bodies, but this isn't the only unique aspect of sponges. Not only are sponges almost all asymmetrical, with just a few exhibiting radial symmetry, but their cells do not organize into tissues or organs. They don't even have a mouth or anus, so there is no digestive tract. Instead, their unique body shapes are adapted to allow for maximal efficiency of water flow through their central cavity, where the water deposits nutrients and then leaves through a hole on their top end called the osculum, meaning little mouth. Some species might have several oscula, though most have just one. The bodies of sponges are made of two thin layers of cells with a jelly-like mesohyl sandwiched between them, which is primarily composed of collagen. The outer layer of a sponge is covered in a single layer of external skin, composed of flat plate-like cells called pinacocytes. Pinacocytes at the base of the animal also anchor it to its substrate, the thing it is stuck to, while those that form its skin can serve not only to protect it, but also to digest organic material. However, the cells most responsible for feeding are choanocytes. These are cylindrical cells with a single flagellum. It is the whip-like motion of these flagella that are responsible for creating a current to drive water through a sponge's body. So an important thing to understand is that sponges don't suck in water. Instead, their insides are lined with tiny flagella-bearing choanocytes that literally create a current around them. This current isn't strong enough to bring in large animals, but tiny living creatures and organic material are easily swept into it. So the flagella whip back and forth, causing a current around the sponge. The water around the sponge is drawn into its pores, which are lined and controlled by porocytes that create closable valves. In addition, there are other cells found within the mesohyl, like the sclerocytes, or spongocytes in the demosponges, which excrete spicules, the structural element of sponges that also deter predators. Many sponges can shed their spicules, forming a dense carpet of spines around them. Other species produce toxins that prevent other sessile organisms, such as bryozoans or sea squirts, from growing on or near them. Many species of sponge also have a variety of other cells that move through their mesohyl. They have oocytes and spermatocytes, which are the reproductive cells, gray cells, which act like immune cells in other animals, amoebocytes, which are amoeba-like totipotent cells that can transform into any other type of cell, and others like myocytes, which conduct signals and allow parts of the animal to contract, as well as several types of collagen-producing cells. Many of these cells, excluding the sclerocytes, can actually move and drift freely in the sponge mesohele. If you look closely at some of these cells, they look and behave almost like individual protozoa, which supports what we learned about the emergence of multicellular life in an earlier tutorial. Now, something fascinating about sponges is that since they lack any true digestive system, almost every one of their cells consumes organic matter. So as water is flowing into their bodies, any tiny organic material such as phytoplankton and detritus that is trapped by a part of the sponge is consumed. This is a type of filter feeding, since the sponges only consume organic material suspended in the water column. However, there are sponges, like the ping-pong tree sponge, that are carnivorous. This uses tiny hooked spicules to capture small crustaceans and slowly digest them alive. This carnivorous behavior is fascinating for sponges, since as adults, these organisms are sessile, meaning they anchor themselves to a substrate and grow from there. Some sponges have taken this behavior to the next level and actually house photosynthesizing endosymbionts within their bodies. These few species produce more food and oxygen than they consume, like plants. But remember, they're still animals. Their bodies capture the endosymbionts. They can't grow them on their own. Also, they, like all species of sponge, are mobile as larvae. Speaking of larvae or baby sponges, let's talk about sponge reproduction. The most common form of reproduction in sponges is sexual. They release sperm cells into the water. In some species, ova, or eggs, are also released into the water, while in others they are held within the bodies of the sponge, hoping to be fertilized by a sperm cell from a different organism belonging to the same species. It's important to note that while most sponges are hermaphrodites, that is, they are male and female at the same time, they don't have gonads, or reproductive organs. Sperm and eggs are instead produced by individual cells. Once an egg cell is fertilized, it develops into a zygote and then into one of 4 types of larvae. All of them are basically tiny cell balls with flagella that line their epidermis. These larvae will then swim for a few days. Fascinatingly, many of these larval sponges possess pigment ring eyes that are sensitive to light and can mediate their locomotion. Eventually, though, they will sink in the water column and then crawl until they find a place to settle. From there, they will slowly grow into adults. Many sponge species can also asexually reproduce using one of 3 different methods, those being budding, fragmentation, and gemmules. Contrary to popular belief, only a few species of sponges can reproduce asexually by budding, where a new sponge develops from an outgrowth, or bud, on the parent sponge, which then drops off. Fragmentation, however, is a bit more common. All known living sponges can remold their bodies. Fragmentation is when a sponge regenerates from fragments that are broken off, although this only works if the fragments include the right types of cells, like the totipotent amoebocytes. It's true that some sponges can completely regenerate from a single cell, but it must be the right cell. Not all sponge cells, and not all sponge species, can do this. The third method of asexual reproduction is through gemmules. When environmental conditions become less hospitable to the sponges, like if temperatures drop, many freshwater species and a few marine ones produce gemmules, which are like tiny survival pods of unspecialized cells that can remain dormant until conditions improve. Then they either form completely new sponges or recolonize the skeletons of their dead parents. To finish up, let's go over the most common body structures, also known as aquiferous systems of sponges, and their extant taxonomic classes. There are three main sponge structures. First, the simple tube or vase shape lined with choanocytes, known as asconoid. Second, the syconoid, or pleated body wall that has inner pockets lined with choanocytes, which connect to the outer pockets. And third, the complex leuconoid pattern, with mesohele that contains a network of chambers lined with choanocytes, connected to each other and to the water intakes and outlet by tubes. This third body type is actually the most common. Less common body structures are the syllabid, which is often considered to be a transitional structure between syconoid and leuconoid conditions, and the solenoid, which is characterized by complex tubes lined with choanocytes. We should point out that the tiny black things lining the inside of the sponge are choanocytes. In terms of taxonomy, the four extant classes of sponges are Demospongia, Calcarea, Hexactinellida, and Homoscleromorpha. The Demospongii are the most common and diverse class by far, with over 8,800 identified species, making up 76% of all sponge species. They are soft-bodied leuconoid sponges with a hard, sometimes massive skeleton made of spicules composed of silica. Some species of Demospongia can live for hundreds or even thousands of years and grow to enormous sizes. The Calcarea, or calcareous sponges, include species from all of the three main body structures, including the solenoid. They have spicule skeletons made of calcium carbonate and are typically small and drab in color. They include about 400 species. The hexactinellid sponges are all leuconoids that are found in the deep sea and commonly called glass sponges. They are unique among the sponges because they can rapidly conduct electrical impulses across their bodies. This makes it possible for them to respond quickly to external stimuli. Lastly, the Homoscleromorpha are either massive or encrusting leuconoid or syllabid sponges with very little variation in spicule form. They have recently been considered to be phylogenetically distinct from the Demospongii.
Tadi kita sudah lihat bersama-sama Profesor Dave pada channel YouTube-nya yang menjelaskan tentang porifera. Bagaimana bagian tubuhnya, struktur tubuhnya, termasuk fungsinya, kemudian bagaimana proses yang terjadi dalam kehidupannya, sistem pencernaan, fotosintesa, reproduksi, dan respirasi, serta klasifikasinya. Sekarang kita coba simpulkan bersama. Jadi porifera itu adalah hewan multiseluler yang paling primitif karena tidak memiliki diferensiasi sel. Hewan ini sering dikenal atau disebut sebagai sport. Tidak memiliki organ khusus untuk reproduksi, pencernaan, respirasi, sensor, atau ekskresi. Nah, dari morfologinya, porifera seperti juga hewan lainnya memiliki kerangka yang dapat memberikan bentuk tubuh. Porifera memiliki elemen kerangka yang beragam, antara lain lamina, gampingan atau kalkareus, filamen organik, dan spikula yang mengandung silika, gampingan, dan kaca. Porifera umumnya berbentuk asimetri. Ada beberapa spesies saja yang menunjukkan simetri radial, dan ukurannya bisa mencapai hampir 1 meter. Bentuknya seperti jambangan bunga, seperti karung, dengan rongga di dalam tubuhnya yang disebut sebagai spongoselom, dan memiliki mulut yang disebut sebagai osculum. Pada porifera yang sederhana, dinding rongga spongosol ini terdiri dari sel-sel yang bercorong atau berflagel yang disebut sebagai koanosit. Sesuai dengan namanya, dinding tubuh porifera itu berpori-pori. Nah, pori-porinya itu disebut sebagai ostium. Ada sel-sel koanosit yang berfungsi sebagai pemicu terjadinya aliran dari luar ke dalam tubuhnya, kemudian untuk menangkap partikel makanan, untuk menangkap spermatozoa, dan seterusnya. Bagian tubuh porifera yang penting juga adalah spikula. Jadi spikula itu ada bentuknya bermacam-macam. Jadi ada yang berbentuk seperti jarum atau monoakson, ada yang bintang bercabang 2 atau triakson, ada yang bintang bercabang 4 atau tetraakson, dan ada bintang yang bercabang banyak atau poliakson. Sampai saat ini telah teridentifikasi lebih dari 900 genus dan ada sekitar 5.000 spesies. Nah, kita lihat tadi klasifikasinya sebagaimana dijelaskan. Beberapa peneliti mengklasifikasikan Filum Porifera ini ke dalam 4 kelas atau 4 kelompok, yaitu yang pertama adalah Demospongia. Demospongia ini memiliki kerangka spikula yang tersusun oleh silikat, serat spongin, atau bisa keduanya. Beberapa spesies yang primitif tidak memiliki kerangka. Bentuk dan ukurannya beragam, ada yang bentuknya seperti kerak tipis saja dengan diameter beberapa senti, dan ada pula yang tebal dan besar. Kelompok ini atau kelas Demospongia ini memiliki spesies yang paling banyak dan paling sering dijumpai. Kemudian kelompok yang kedua adalah Calcarea. Calcarea memiliki kerangka spikula yang tersusun oleh kalsium karbonat, calcareous atau gampingan atau kalsium karbonat. Bentuk dari kelas ini berbentuk vas, kemudian ada berbentuk silinder atau kerangka lainnya. Sama seperti porifera lainnya juga memiliki tabung, tapi di sini tabungnya tipis dengan jaringan atau koloni yang tidak teratur. Nah, ada sebagian yang berukuran kecil. Nah, kelas yang ketiga adalah Hexatenellida. Biasanya dikenal sebagai spon glass karena spikulanya terbuat dari silika. Silika ini ada yang bercabang 4 atau 6 dan biasanya melekat bersama-sama dalam rangka silindris yang konikal atau konikal. Kemudian kelompok ini secara tunggal biasanya berbentuk silinder, vas atau guci, dan ada beberapa di antaranya yang bercabang. Tingginya mencapai 10 sampai 30 cm. Kelompok lain adalah Homoscleromorpha. Beberapa peneliti mengelompokkannya atau beberapa peneliti mengelompokkan kelompok lain itu dalam kelas Kerospongiae, yaitu yang terdiri atau tersusun oleh kerangka yang terbuat dari kalsium karbonat, silika, atau spongin. Nah, sekarang kita lihat bersama-sama video yang akan menjelaskan tentang lingkungan dan keberadaan takson ini dalam umur biologi.
In terms of where they live, even though they can live in pretty much any aquatic environment on Earth today, the majority, or about 80% of them, live in shallow marine waters where there is substrate available for them to attach to. Also, they prefer areas with moderate to strong currents because this increases the water flow through their canals, and so they can filter feed easier. And another beneficial thing for sponges is that they have relatively few predators. Basically, certain types of sea turtles, fish, snails, sea stars, and chitons might munch on them from time to time, but the most thing they're useful for is for protection. Some types of worms, arthropods, fish, mollusks, and protozoans seek shelter in their protective spongicles. And so I put here to remind myself, funny shrimp anecdote. That's because the book that I'm reading that is helping me make these lectures, which is linked below if you want to look into it, they explain this in a really funny way, or I thought it was funny. But basically they mention that sometimes when shrimp go into the spongicles for protection, they stay in there so long and molt a bunch of times because shrimp molt to grow that they get so big by the time they try and go out, they can't fit out of the spongicle. And so they are stuck in there. And sometimes when pairs of shrimp get stuck in the spongicle, they can get fossilized like that. And these fossilized shrimp pairs that are trapped in this glass ball are actually a common wedding gift in some cultures because apparently the concept of these two shrimp being trapped inside this ball is symbolic of marriage. I just thought that was hilarious. hilarious. So anyway, moving on. Many sponges are important reef builders, and we'll talk about kind of the history of different sponges being dominant in reefs at different times in Earth history on the next slide. But the fossil record is a little fuzzy for sponges because, like we said, the spicules preserve, but sometimes they're just spicules. They're not actually attached to a sponge animal in a fossil. And so because the whole sponge doesn't always preserve, we have had to piece together a general pattern of sponge evolution without an entire picture. And so with this, we'll look now at the evolution of sponge. So if we look here at this timeline from the Mesozoic Paleozoic, first we have the sponge classes all evolve. We have the hexactinellids, the calcarea, the demospongia, and the sclerospongia, maybe question mark, all evolved here in the early Cambrian. Then what we have is the extinction of the archaeocyathans, which I know we haven't talked about, but I thought for the purpose of the evolutionary slide, I should include it on this timeline because the archaeocyathans were really important reef builders, and nothing in the early to middle Cambrian was creating reefs other than archaeocyathans. And so after their extinction, other types of reef builders or types of sponges that could reef build started to evolve. So then we have the sponges, especially demosponges, become dominant reef builders in the Ordovician, and then we have tabulate and rugose corals diversify and kind of get into the reef building business as well. And then we had sponges become less important reef builders because of coral evolution and corals taking over the reef building business, if you will. However, one of the groups that didn't become less important in reefs was stromatoporoids. Coral strome reefs were really common around this time. Then you had the Devonian extinction, which caused a decline in coral strome reefs, and hexactinellids actually took over the reef building business, which, if you remember, are the glass sponges. And then you had Permian reefs, which were largely built by calcareous sphinctozoan sponges. Then you had the Permian extinction, which thankfully all of the major sponge groups did survive. However, during the Mesozoic, they began to decline in their dominance. And at the end of the Mesozoic, stromatoporoids went extinct at the KT extinction boundary. And during the Cenozoic, all the major sponge groups continued to decline in their abundance and dominance to the point that today they are only minor contributors to most reef habitats. However, they're still very common on Earth today. You just don't see them.
Dalam video yang kedua, tadi kita lihat atau kita bisa saksikan bersama-sama di mana lingkungan dan keberadaan takson ini dalam umur geologi. Jadi porifera merupakan hewan yang kebanyakan hidup di perairan dangkal, baik itu di laut maupun juga di air tawar. Kebanyakan porifera ini hidup menempel pada berbagai macam substrat, jadi batuan, pecahan cangkang, hingga batu barang yang ada di dasar laut. Selain ini, porifera juga sangat tergantung pada partikel-partikel yang tersuspensi di dalam air sebagai makanannya. Kalau kita lihat dari kelas-kelasnya, jadi Demospongia ini, Demospongia, kelas yang pertama, ini dapat tumbuh menjadi sangat besar dan biasanya ditemukan hampir di semua perairan tropis atau subtropis atau pada lingkungan laut lainnya. Bisa atau sering berada pada daerah intertidal dengan kedalaman hampir atau sampai 5.500 meter. Kemudian yang kedua adalah kalkarea. Kalkarea ini semuanya hidup di dalam laut. Hidup baik sebagai individu tunggal maupun sebagai koloni, mendiami perairan dangkal di semua lautan di daerah pasang surut atau hingga kedalaman 200 atau bahkan ada beberapa yang mencapai 800 meter. Terutama banyak dijumpai di perairan tropis yang dangkal di dekat pantai. Beberapa diantaranya dapat hidup di kedalaman sampai dengan 1.000 meter. Kemudian kelompok lainnya adalah hexatelemida, hidup di laut atau dikenal sebagai spons laut dalam, biasanya dijumpai pada perairan yang dalam dan dingin, menempel di dasar laut pada kedalaman mulai dari 25 meter sampai 8.500 meter. Hewan ini menempel kuat pada permukaan yang keras, kemudian beberapa spesies menempel pada sedimen yang lunak. Nah, dilihat dari umurnya, fosil spon atau porifera adalah salah satu fosil yang tertua yang diketahui. Berasal mulai atau ditemukan mulai sejak Prakambrium akhir. Kelas yang terakhir, kelas Sclerospongiae, sebagian besar hanya dijumpai dalam bentuk fosilnya. Dan beberapa spesies saja yang modern yang dijumpai di terumbu karang baik di Samudra Hindia maupun Pasifik. Oke, jadi tadi kita sudah saksikan bersama ya video mengenai porifera. Tadi kita lihat dari mulai membahas mengenai apa itu porifera, ciri-cirinya, kemudian eh, morfologinya dan pembagian atau pengklasifikasiannya. Kemudian juga tadi kita lihat di mana dia umurnya dalam sejarah geologi dan juga lingkungannya. Nah, setelah pembelajaran ini, adik-adik nanti diminta untuk membuat resume kira-kira 2 sampai 3 lembar ya. Nanti untuk petunjuk resume yang harus dibuat nanti saya sertakan. Gitu barangkali ya. Nah, kalau begitu kita akhiri kuliah hari ini. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.